This is a revision video for AQA GCSE Biology Unit 7, the ecology topic, looking at food webs. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers and tertiary consumers from a food chain or food web, predators, prey and also trophic levels. You should also be able to describe and explain the impact of removing an organism from a food web. Before we look at food webs, we need to be clear on food chains, which are basically the simplified version that we start with. So in a food chain, pictures or names of organisms are linked by arrows, and the arrow represents the transfer of energy. You can think of the arrow as meaning is eaten by. It shows you which way the energy is moving through the food chain. So it always needs to go from the thing being eaten to the thing eating it. So here I have a cabbage and an insect called a cabbage white butterfly, which lays its eggs on the underside of the leaves of the cabbage, and they will then eat it. And then the cabbage white butterfly is eaten by a sparrow. But where does the energy come from in the first place for the food chain to take place? Every food chain begins with an organism called a producer, which is able to make its own food. The majority of producers are green plants or photosynthetic algae, which are able to transfer energy from the sun in the form of light in order to complete photosynthesis and make glucose. Around 1% of the energy from the sun is transferred in this way. So organisms that can make their own food are called producers, and everything else is a consumer, consume meaning to eat. We can give these different levels, so something that consumes a producer is a primary consumer, and something that consumes a primary consumer is a secondary consumer. And in fact, we even have tertiary consumers. Generally speaking, it's rare for a food chain to have more than 4 trophic levels, because at each level we lose some energy, and by the time you get this high, it's very hard for an ecosystem to support any more trophic levels. Animals that hunt and eat other animals are also referred to as predators, and the very last predator in a food chain is called an apex predator, apex meaning the very, very top of a pyramid. The things that the predator eats are called its prey. You need to understand that in a stable community, the numbers of predators and their prey will rise and fall in cycles. You can see this on my graph here. The blue line represents the numbers of prey and the red line represents the numbers of predators. And you can see that as the prey increase, so do the predators, but there's a slight time lag. And then the prey come down and the predators come down, and again there's a slight time lag. As the predator numbers rise, they're more able to hunt the prey, and therefore inevitably the prey numbers will fall. However, when the prey numbers fall, the predators don't have enough food to eat, and therefore their numbers will fall. This then allows the numbers of prey to recover. In addition to describing the general cyclical nature of predator and prey numbers, you need to be able to describe and explain what will happen to the organisms in a food chain if a particular organism is removed. So for instance here, if the cabbage white butterflies, which are the second organism in the food chain, all die out, maybe because they have a disease, then what will happen to the number of cabbages and what will happen to the number of sparrows? Well, since the butterflies aren't eating the cabbages anymore, presumably more of them will survive for longer and therefore their numbers will increase. The sparrows don't have enough food to eat anymore and therefore their numbers will decrease. Of course, in real life, things aren't quite this straightforward because most organisms have more than one food source. So now we need to look at food webs. Here's a food web representing a British river system. As you can see, it's made of lots and lots of interlocking food chains joined together. Let's see what happens if one of these organisms is removed. To start with, let's look at the mayflies because this is quite straightforward. The mayflies are eaten by the dragonflies and the frogs. So since they both lose their only food source, they will also die out completely. At the same time, the mayflies won't be eating the microscopic plants and the algae. So their numbers will increase. The increase in the number of algae will also have a knock-on positive effect on the water fleas and the water boatmen. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than this to predict what will happen in a food web. Let's say that all the sticklebacks die out. The sticklebacks are eaten by the kingfishers, so losing this food source could cause their numbers to drop. However, the the kingfishers also eat minnows, and so it's quite likely that they'll just eat more minnows in order to stop from starving. However, the stickleback had been eating the water fleas. Now that the stickleback are not eating the water fleas, their numbers should rise. This means that the minnows have a larger food source, which could cause their numbers to rise, or at least not to be completely suppressed by being eaten more by the kingfishers. So it's quite hard to predict what's going to happen to the numbers of minnows. If you're taking GCSE Biology or Triple Science, there's a couple of extra bits that you need to know. The first thing is a pair of words you've been using for years. An animal that eats plant matter is called a herbivore, and an animal that eats other animals is called a carnivore. Sometimes it can get a little bit confusing talking about primary consumers and secondary consumers, and it's easier to just talk in terms of numbered levels. We call these trophic levels because trophic is anything to do with eating. So our producer is trophic level number 1, our primary consumer is trophic level number 2, our sparrow is trophic level number 3, and our kestrel is trophic level number 4. Feeding on all 4 of these trophic levels are microorganisms like fungi and bacteria called decomposers, which break down dead plant and animal matter by secreting enzymes into their environment. Once those enzymes have basically digested the dead animal or plant matter, the small soluble food molecules can diffuse back into the microorganism. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you found this a useful introduction to food webs, trophic levels, and predator-prey relationships. Next, we'll be looking at pyramids of biomass, so don't forget to like and subscribe for more GCSE biology updates coming soon.